Lately, it seems every passing second brings news of another climate-driven disaster. But we still have the power to turn back the clock. Harnessing the power of collective human energy, today's university students are working together to chart a new future, demanding and creating the solutions for a sustainable climate. Our focus in science, engineering, activism, and politics offers the potential of a better tomorrow for all of us. Tune in to Campus Climate Corps for news of what is and what is not happening at this year's UN Climate Conference. Prepare for a livable tomorrow with a life and career of action. Join us and become part of the solution.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to day 3 of Campus Climate Corps' daily briefings, where we're covering COP27, what's happening, what's not happening. What do you want to see? What interviews can we get? It's all happening right here. And thanks to every one of you attending today and tuning in. We are going to make sure that your voices are represented as strongly as we can from our folks in Egypt right now. Today we have some good content for you, and I really do like to say that I do enjoy the introductory video, because all the news that I'm watching about COP27 right now makes me feel the other way. Instead of feeling hopeful about the future, some of the news makes me feel just quite the opposite. However, at the very least, we're doing what we can. We're doing what we can. For those of you who are paying attention to COP, you might have seen activists all over the globe protesting Coca-Cola's big sponsorship of the program. This coming even as Coca-Cola is increasing its plastic use all over its company. Egypt's most prominent political minister also did come out today and say that he has very high hopes for COP27, but we need to be realistic about some of the expectations about this time. Many of the most vulnerable countries stood up today on the podium at the World Leaders Summit and addressed, I think, what is the biggest elephant in the room about COP27, and that is reparations and development of these developing nations as they are gearing up to face the climate crisis from the perspective of a non-industrialized nation. So deciding what they're going to do and what chartered course they're going to approach, how they're going to address the climate crisis as they are attempting to develop at the same time is really going to be a crucial discussion here at COP27. Those are some of the major headlines, although today is day 1. So proceeding over the next couple of weeks, we are going to be seeing differences in opinions. We're going to be seeing differences in what outcomes are happening. What was the result of the deforestation agreement that happened last year? What about methane production and the halting of methane production as agreed in last year's COP26? But for right now, we are going to turn it over to our broadcasters from the Campus Climate Corps team in Egypt right now. So Esteban, take it away. Oh, you're muted, by the way.
By now, I'm becoming accustomed at the little confusion at the beginning, but I reacted faster than yesterday. So good evening, everyone. Today was the first day that we have activity besides registration. What you can see is essentially the pavilions that we were showing 2 days ago, but as you can see, it's filled with people, and actually the pavilion's official activity hasn't begun yet. As we told you 2 transmissions ago, the Egyptian government postponed the activity of the pavilions to November 8th. However, we've seen today a lot of preparations in the pavilions. There's people you can talk to. Some even went ahead and hosted talks and events. We don't have clarity as to whether this is against the original scheme or they were actually allowed to do it as an exception. But that's what we've seen today.
Fair enough. Fair enough. I'm just curious, walking through the pavilions at COP. I mean, if you can take a look around behind you right now, you're directly in the middle of it. Are people saying anything, like the lay people attending COP, not the politicians, but rather the NGOs and the delegates? Are you getting a
Well,
sense of what the feeling is towards COP as it begins?
it all depends on where you ask. It all depends on which pavilion you're at. But unfortunately, the pavilions that had more activity were the ones with the big shots. Essentially, I just came from a small conference, small but with very important people, with the First Minister of Scotland and the Prime Minister of Barbados. So today, essentially, those are the pavilions that are probably getting the exceptions to actually have activity, as opposed to the small pavilions, the pavilions of the NGOs, the pavilions of smaller interest groups and other institutions.
Wonderful. I am personally very curious about what Nicola Sturgeon is saying at COP27. Last year, Nicola Sturgeon made big headlines as being one of the major focal points for proving women action on the climate front. Nicola Sturgeon has been a big supporter of utilizing the Scottish lands for wind development. I think she was probably one of the strongest supporters of that initiative last year, and was really, showcased, what real power folks like her really have in positions, like being Prime Minister of Scotland or First Minister of Scotland. Anyway, Valhalla, let's move to you real quick. Do you have any observations right now about COP27 in your, the conferences that you've attended, the briefings? What do you think?
So far, pretty slow day. Not much is happening yet. I've been trying to go in and see the Indigenous and youth groups and what they're up to, but nothing's really started yet. I've attended a few meetings, but mainly I've just been trying to connect with youth, especially the ones that I saw at COI. And I was actually able to connect with a few different people I saw at the meetings there. And a lot of them were with the group Earth Uprising. And they were just as disappointed as Esteban and I. And they were pointing out the same exact things, if not more, of how terrible it was. And even going on to mention that they've been to events or they've organized events with less funding that were way more prepared, and it was just a bad space, and it should have been so much more, especially with the funding they had. So just a reiteration of all the disappointments of that. But I was able to catch up with one of my old co-plaintiffs, the named plaintiff on Reynolds v. Florida case from a few years back, Delaney Reynolds. She's here and she is researching for her law degree at University of Miami. And it's been a lot of drudgery for her as well. But at least there is some semblance of professionalism here.
Wonderful. That's really good to hear. I really would like to host Delaney here on the program at some point. It's funny that you mentioned about the funding and the financing, mostly as a result of COP27 and COP28 next year being held in and around some of the richest oil nations in the world. Abu Dhabi next year is one of the oil capitals of the world. I don't think that is, I think that was specifically done to be on purpose, though. The fact that Abu Dhabi is one of the oil capitals of the world and that COP28 will be held there. But I am curious about folks and their perceptions about why Sharm el-Sheikh is so close to the oil capitals of the world, and some of the biggest delegations at COP26 and then now at COP27 do seem to be these oil-led delegations. As we mentioned yesterday, it was quite interesting to see that Russia and China only have minor delegates that are being sent to COP27. They don't even have major pavilions. A couple of years ago in Madrid, China had one of the nicer pavilions, showcasing some of the leading technology that they're developing there, which is really curious that they're not having it this year. One thing that I'll ask maybe the two of you to do is to pass by the French pavilion and the nuclear pavilion. I do want to see what they're developing in terms of their potential nuclear power, especially ahead of the winter of 2022 of this year, which is supposedly going to be one of the worst years for the energy crisis in Europe. Anyway, moving on, we do have our first interview. So we're going to showcase to you an interview. Esteban, before we get into it, do you want to maybe mention a little bit about who these folks are and why you chose them as our potential interviewees?
Yes. Kate and James are farmers from northern England, and they gave arguably, and I mean, we went to a bunch of talks at COI, but according to Valholi and me, at least one of the most interesting, if not the most interesting talk at the whole of COI. And essentially, what they were sharing were the practices to which they switched their farm, essentially to have less emissions and have better care of the soil. At the same time that they emphasized that they didn't have lesser yields. It's definitely an interesting project. At the same time, we also talked a little bit about subsidies and their dynamics in the current UK, in the Brexit UK. So yeah, it was definitely interesting content, and that's why we decided to interview them in particular.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, without further ado, let's get right into it.
Hi. Would you mind introducing yourselves for Campus Climate Corps?
Hi, my name is Kate Adams. I am from the UK, Scotland specifically, and I work for the National Farmers Union in the northeast of England as an environment and land use advisor. So working with local members, but also local stakeholders to really showcase exactly what agriculture can do to address the climate crisis.
And my name is James. I am a farmer that's part of the National Farmers Union. The reason why I've been asked to come here to talk today is about food security in regards to farming in a regeneratively farming manner, and how livestock and farming can be a huge part of the climate solution.
Right. Would you mind telling us in very few words, we'll further report on this, giving us a little bit of context about your recent talk?
Yeah, absolutely. So the talk that we just did, we really wanted to put a spotlight on agriculture and food security. So we all know that farmers are really on the front line of the climate crisis right across the whole world. So they are dealing with the impacts of climate change just now. But in addition to that, that's also impacting our global food security. So the talk that we've just given really wanted to bring that into a sharp focus, but also to highlight exactly what young farmers specifically need from large policy decisions and large conferences such as COP27, to highlight what they further need to facilitate further action.
Wonderful. And can you give us a little bit of detail of what practices are you conducting in your farm?
So on our farm, we are in the north of England, in a county called Yorkshire. We have beef cattle, sheep, and we grow crops. As part of our thing, we're trying to make our farm more resilient to climate change. That's by improving soil health, by using different plant species to build up soil organic matter, to provide habitat for biodiversity, but also to produce our food. So in regards to grazing, we're trying to move things more in a holistic grazing matter. So trying to do things what it would be like in the wild by moving animals on a regular way, letting that land have a rest from animal grazing, which allows root development, which interacts more with the nutrients it has around it. But also by increasing that root development, we're also more resilient to any sort of changes in climate in regards to like drought and high periods of rain, because we're able to filtrate that because we're increasing organic matter levels. In regards to crops, we are looking at different ways to improve biodiversity and using cover crops to build fertility in our soils, reducing the amount of fertilisers and chemicals that we're using, but not affecting about how much food we produce. So food security is still the key part of our business, but trying to work with nature and not against it.
Brilliant. And how widespread would you say these practices are in your area, in Northern England?
I would say it's something that's gaining more momentum. I think the way the farming policy has changed in England, with the war in Ukraine and the inputs rising, it's become more of a hot topic of the idea of regenerative agriculture. So I think it's gained a lot more momentum. It's not just in our country, but more worldwide as well. Because I mean, one of my big inspirations for doing this was actually from a guy in America called Gabe Brown. So he was one of our my big inspirations about how to do it, because he said he had done it, and that was one of our big inspirations to do it.
Are there conversations ongoing among local farmers on how to expand these practices?
Yeah, absolutely there are, and that's something that as the National Farmers Union we're always really keen to facilitate as well. So we're really keen to bring local farmers together and have meetings with them so that people can come out onto farm and, for example, go to James's farm and have a walk around and hear directly from the farmer about specifically about what they're doing. And we find that's a really valuable way. Peer-to-peer learning and farmer-to-farmer learning is incredibly valuable, and it definitely can't be underestimated in its power either. And as James has just mentioned, it's definitely gaining in popularity, and with the meetings that we're having and hosting, we're seeing an increasing number of members attending them, which is absolutely brilliant.
And just to follow up on one of the first aspects of your talk, you mentioned subsidies, and subsidies for farmers in Europe have been in place for a long time as a matter also of food security. But would you say that current subsidies are rewarding these practices? Are they targeted towards these practices, or for the moment, no, the subsidies may not be?
Well, we're in an incredibly unique position in the UK. Now that we've left the European Union, we're actually moving away from the Common Agricultural Policy, and we're implementing and generating a new policy that's going to be called Environmental Land Management, where the focus is on payment for public goods. So it will provide payments to farmers for farming in more environmentally friendly ways, such as improving soil health, but also looking towards improving water management as well, and integrating things such as hedgerows onto farms. So this is sort of trying to target funding more, obviously farming in a more environmentally friendly manner, but we still have a long way to go until that funding is up and running. James, you might have some more specifics from your experiences that you'd like to add.
I think the funding is looking at ways to change to reward these sorts of systems, but one of the biggest concern I have currently is food security. Mm-hmm. We have huge amounts of land that are being used to plant trees, used for put solar panels on for renewable energies, which is a good thing, but it's whether we are doing right by using up land that is a valuable way of producing food in a climate that is changing our way. We've got lots of people that are in desert. I mean, we are in Egypt. They struggle to produce a lot of their own food. They're a high importer. So is it right for us to be planting trees and doing this sort of thing where we can actually farm the land in a right way but also produce food? And I think that we should be looking at the farming as more of a global scale and looking at who is going to be the best major food producers. We're looking at just for the now. In 20 years' time, the climate will have changed again, and there'll be some areas. It's going to be the biggest migration of people is down to food poverty, and so we need to make sure that all land is still able to produce food, because if we don't act now, we could be in more trouble in 20 years' time.
Oh, Holly, any questions?
I guess just right now, how can farmers contact you and be a part of this?
How can farmers contact us? I have an Instagram page, which is MALLARD_farm, Mallard Farm, which I get a tremendous amount of ideas from Instagram. It's amazing, the social media power. I'm not a big lover of it, but it does provide you a huge amount of effort. And I mean, I think we need more cooperation between our farming bodies such as the NFU.
Yep, absolutely. I was just going to comment on that as well. We would encourage any farmers organisations or anybody that's interested in learning a little bit more about what global farmers are doing. There's the farmers constituency under the UNFCCC, so similar to Youngo, and that brings together farming organisations from across the world, and really does provide a place to have these discussions and conversations. So we would really encourage anybody to get in touch with us via those means as well. And as I say, definitely follow James on Instagram.
Wonderful. We'll have your information available for Campus Climate Corps. Thank you. We'll see you at COP.
That's great. Thank you.
Absolutely wonderful interview. The topic of regenerative agriculture, for those of you who may not know, is a little bit particular to me. It's what my own master's thesis topic is currently being written on. One proposal that I really did enjoy that they made was many countries are going to need to specialize. Some countries are going to specialize more, some are going to specialize less in agriculture. The need for a global community to focus on the development of technology and the spread of technology and the concentration of technology into certain nations that will become breadbaskets of the world, I think is vitally crucial and vitally important. Regardless of what century you look through in history, there always were nations whose climate specific to that country enabled them to become breadbaskets. Ukraine, Egypt, for example, those nations traditionally have been real gigantic producers of food for the surrounding countries, and the communities that surrounded them that typically bought a lot of their production of grain, rice, etc. Taking that perspective and moving forward with it, I think, is also extremely crucial. Agriculture right now and production of food is the #1 cause of global carbon emissions right now. Close to almost 24% of all global carbon emissions are as a result directly of agriculture. Some of this does have taken into account the destruction of forests to make land for grazing cattle. And as many of you might know, the #1 producer of carbon within the subsection of agricultural carbon emissions is beef. Beef is the #1 carbon emitter out of the entirety of agricultural production and emissions. Solving this issue of agriculture will be a major issue within COP27 and succeeding COPs. And like we discussed during our main conference on Friday the 4th, we did talk a little bit about the need for developing nations and developed nations to communicate together on the technology spread. Nations who are developed have already had their chance to industrialize, have already invested the energy to create a center point, a focal point for where science can be invested in and technology developed in a much faster and sustainable way than developing nations need to be sharing this technology with developing nations. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about this. One of the major discussions at COP27 must be the free spread of technology from developed nations to developing nations. If we're going to fight this COP, if we're going to fight this climate change fight together, and if COP really is going to take a stance on what it can do for developing nations that are asking for the funding, they're asking for the way to industrialize, the way to advance their economies in such a way that their people can actually put food on the table and their middle class can grow, etc. This is the key and crucial point. The technology, at the very least, should be the first thing that is spread for free, and the scientists spread for free to these developing nations so that they can help their economies industrialize in a sustainable and workable fashion. And going back to the discussion with regenerative agriculture, this is a key and crucial technology being developed in developed nations right now. It's people like me who are studying and how to develop this right here in Florida. And I think that with the right amount of funding and the right amount of technology spread, we can ensure that multiple countries across the world, developing and developed, have access to carbon farming so that future breadbaskets of the world, future breadbaskets as their climate changes, their temperate environments might change more into areas where you can grow food better. Technology needs to be spread to those nations as soon as possible. Esteban, did you have any other thoughts regarding the interview with those folks? Any other, post-interview thoughts and feelings?
It's very interesting what James mentions of thinking of agriculture in a global way, because there are two opposing tendencies within the movement. There is one that says eat everything local, but at the same time, what James says, it's true. Not every country has the same capacity to produce food, and at the same time, we need to consider our emissions from transportation overseas are not as bad as transportation from air or from land, depending. If we consider that, and there is interesting content on Act, which is a YouTube channel that at some point considers this aspect, whereas ships use the worst kind of fuel. At the same time, they economize a lot because they can transport huge amounts of cargo. And given that they are on water, there is less friction, and therefore the transportation overseas is rather advantageous. And there is a tendency that we will have to solve within the movement for against climate change. Essentially, there will be a question of, well, what to do. Do we keep considering the world as one, as James suggests, and do we try to coordinate our activities in the sense of having countries that are specialized food baskets, or do we press forward with localizing every production of food?
Absolutely. And it is a crucial discussion that I would like to see play out at COP27. This is the forum where questions like this must be asked, and questions like this should be answered. I don't believe that spending another year developing an answer to this question, when it's simply a matter of putting the funders and those who are farmers in the same room and saying, this has to be done now. I think that as the youth, we might see things a little bit differently in the need to get things done faster. But I don't think this is a youth, an experience issue. This is a funder and fundee issue. This is about the money issue. As with any kind of new technology spread, the funders are the ones who determine when this comes through the line. If the technology exists, it's simply a matter of funding, then it's simply a matter of putting the funders in the room and saying, this needs to be done now. Whether that's the government, private investors, I don't think I really care. I think it just needs to get done regardless. Valhalla, did you have any thoughts on the interview with the farmers in England?
It honestly made me think of like indigenous farming and indigenous land management. And that's an interesting topic when it comes to being in the UK. But along with just indigenous like land back and that whole movement and indigenous practices when it comes to managing land, and especially now I've been learning that all across the globe, of course, so many indigenous voices are silenced when it comes to how to protect the land, even though there have been so many practices in place for centuries, like how a lot of tribes in California would have controlled burns, basically. And now the governments out there aren't listening to the indigenous people, and now they're having wildfires, and now they're trying to go back and say, well, help, you said you could, and aside from trying to think of like what that all means for indigenous land rights, it just brings up the question of land in general and how much space we're going to really have back. And that's especially a big thing in Florida with sea level rise and everything, because not only with our growing population and our seeming resistance to building up and instead building out, what it all is going to mean, and where we're going to get the space, and if it's going to continue to come from deforestation. Just so much planning has to go into it, and a lot of questions are being asked and not many are being answered. So hopefully there will be more discussions at this year's COP.
Absolutely. Rana asks a really good question. Is there a value placed on payment for environmental services? This is, I think, a key and necessary question at a COP27 conference, but the discussion about what that means begins at a university level. We discussed yesterday and on the Friday, the fourth day for our COP conference, the idea of embodied energy, or something called emergy. This is the idea that you can quantify and put a actual quantifiable number on any sort of energy in the system. The idea that the sun, because it produces all of our energy, sun produces, or gives the energy to grass, grass feeds cows, cows produce meats, we eat the meats, therefore we have absorbed energy from a cow that ate the grass, that came from the sun, that ate the rat, that lived in my house. Anyway, the idea is all the energy came from the sun at some point or another. So when you ask the idea about how we're going to pay for financial, how or what do we ascribe to a limit or the price on any sort of item or any sort of idea of fixing the environment, I think we use the idea of embodied energy. We determine exactly how much energy it would take to restore an ecosystem to adapt to certain circumstances. Like how much money would it actually take for us to relocate a city along the coast because of climate issues of sea level rise? Or how much would it take to invest in creating, a whole new program for farmers? I think that the idea is we use systems like embodied energy, determine how much energy it would take to do any sort of action in terms of fighting climate change. And we simply assign, we simply say it would take this amount of money to solve the issue because it requires this much energy to accomplish. And then we start working with the funders who work with the government. We work with local agencies who can actually get these things done and put a proposal together and actually get it funded. Let me take the idea, for example, of carbon farming or regenerative agriculture, for instance, right? Florida right now, as I mentioned before, the number 2 industry in Florida, in the state of Florida, is agriculture after tourism. The agriculture in Florida produces an insane amount of methane, an insane amount of CO2. If we were to transform that entire system from adopting electric tractors to utilizing new fertilizer systems to educating farmers on how they're going to operate these electric tractors and utilize, better fertilizers for the ground, less pesticides, different pesticides, all of the above, right? That is a massive transformation, and that's a massive budget to try and accomplish. We use embodied energy by assigning exactly how much energy it would take to transform every every farm into a carbon-free farm. How much would it take to import those electric tractors? How much would it take to educate farmers on what kind of fertilizers to use, what pesticides to use, et cetera? It's an entire systems analysis and looking at the entire system and saying, let's break it down into every little compartmentalized detail and see how we're going to get that detail accomplished step by step. Hopefully that was a good answer to that question. Next, we have an interview by our own Michael Fidler. So without further ado, we're going to turn it over to Michael. Let's get it running.
This year's conference is taking place in International Congress Center in Sharm el-Sheikh. Visually very attractive, very nice place. After all, its name is Tonino Lamborghini International Congress Center, so I guess that the name says it all. Very colorful, marble everywhere, not a bad place at all. It is very close to the Sharm el-Sheikh International Airport, so as the event is filling up with the delegations and observers and all other kind of participants, there are just airplanes flying by every few minutes. But first thing first, in order to get in, you need to get registered. To get the badge at the registration desk, it took just a few minutes, but to get the organization registered and become, let's say, an organization with the observer status, it takes months. It takes actually more than a year. But once you get the registration done, you get the badge within a few minutes, and then you can get in. So first image after entering the Congress Center for the first time. Some people were coming for the registration in swimming trunks and flip-flops, so it felt like they are still on holidays, but I assume that in a day or two, when the negotiation starts, they will come in more appropriate attire. Obviously, there are the COP signs everywhere, so the delegations are taking photos to prove that they were here at COP 2027. Once you are in, I always get the feeling that something is going to happen in the positive sense, that the atmosphere of the place, it's just UN. It gives me the feeling, yes, here we are, something is going to happen. This year, finally, something will change, because the size of the plenaries or of the working rooms, it's always massive. Here it's still all empty because these photos were taken on Saturday when the final preparations were being done. But again, I simply get the feeling when entering the plenaries, this is so huge that something has to happen. Let me give you a quick overview of the venue, or at least some parts of it, which were already accessible. The first time I went there on Saturday, and there was still some construction going on. The pavilions, where some of them were not accessible, some of them were completely prepared and ready, some of them were still getting the final touch-ups. But the size of the pavilions is pretty huge, so there was a huge amount of work done to get the pavilions ready. Here will be a German pavilion, still with letters, but I think they were pretty much prepared. Here is an example of another pavilion which was on Saturday prepared, but it was still empty. Nothing was going on. Nothing was going on there. Pavilion of Togo with a delegation of Togo. So, of course, a photo opportunity. Hey, here we are at COP27. So they asked me to take their photos. So of course I had to do that. Some of the photos taken there are very formal. So some of the pavilions are very formal. So here, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and very formal photos, very professional. Some of the pavilions were all done, they were all relaxed that they managed to prepare it, and they were just watching rugby. After all, watching it in 4K resolution, that's not bad at all. This would be one of the meeting rooms. It was prepared, so for the acoustic test there was some Arabic music being played, but it does not really matter whether you play whatever you play there. The Arabic music was fine for testing purposes. I am originally from the Czech Republic, and the Czech Republic holds is the president of the European Union these 6 months. So the EU pavilion will be actually managed by the Czech Republic. So when I got there and saw it, I was just curious to see. And it turns out that there are some negotiation rooms, and they are named after the big Czech cities. One of the rooms being called Plzeň, which is where the beer comes from, the Pilsner beer, and where I come from. So after 5 minutes being at COP, I already felt like being at home. But here another example of some pavilions. We'll get more coverage from there as soon as they will open, which will probably happen on Tuesday or Wednesday. And this photo was taken already on Sunday when some of the pavilions had a bit of a program. But to be honest, I would say that was maybe 5% of all the pavilions had something going on there. The rest was just empty. COP was formally opened on Sunday. This would be an image from the opening ceremony. And on Sunday then formally started the negotiations and discussions within the various working group and stakeholders and so on. Here would be an image from one of the working groups after their group discussions. Some of the workshops and plenaries are not accessible at all times, so sometimes the transmission needs to be watched online or on the COP27 TV. Some of the meetings are accessible, or the press conferences are accessible, so you get a chance to be there, sit there and listen. Here would be another image from one of the meeting rooms where some discussions were going on. Yet another one. This gives you, this should give you the an idea that it's simply an international event. Yet another small meeting discussion that was going on. I came in a little late, listened it for a few minutes, but it was mostly just procedure stuff, how the materials will be shared, whether it would be on flash disk or some other way. So not a technical discussions yet, but mostly just procedural stuff. Obviously, the cameras are everywhere. There is a massive amount of press people, so the conference is transmitted to the whole world. So cameras are getting ready and rolling. And here would be an image of some of the results of one of the working group discussions. So you can pause here and read what this working group agreed on.
So what did the working group agree on? Anyway, what Michael's presentation is saying here is that you can go to each of these conferences, each of these locations, and they have a little bit about what's going on for that specific area.
Yet another image from a press conference. And this would be an image from one of the plenaries where they were approving the program for the next few days negotiations. That's the same plenary during the same session, but look at the size of the plenary. I simply get a feeling, or I keep a hope that something will change this year. So with keeping this hope, I am ending this short video for today, and I'll be back tomorrow.
And we look forward to having Michael back tomorrow. I think that was an excellent presentation. I thoroughly enjoyed seeing a little bit of an area closer to, I imagine, what you guys are seeing every single day as you go through. So for anyone who is watching live, you're just seeing a few pictures of what's going on right now at COP. Although right now we're going to move into a different discussion. We have our very own Dr. John Capice, who's going to be joining us and giving a little bit of an explanation of his experiences over there today. John, are you able to hear and communicate? How's your connection?
Well, you tell me. I can hear you just fine.
Fantastic. Okay, why don't you take it away?
Okay. Well, today I thought I'd talk a little bit about one of the issues that is front and center here at COP, and that's loss and damage. And I'll explain to you what that is and some of the perspectives on it. But I also thought while I'm speaking, I'd play a slide set created by another organization dealing with this issue, and that'll provide a little background reading while I'm speaking. So Rock, perhaps you can allow me to share my screen.
You should be able to go do that now.
Mm-hmm. Now, loss and damage is one of these emerging issues. Initially, COP was focused on mitigation. How do we solve the climate crisis? How do we reduce greenhouse gases? And then other issues began developing as the years passed. This is the 27th COP. So clearly, we've not made significant progress on mitigating greenhouse gases. So now we have to deal with the implications. One of those implications is loss and damage. Basically, it's the direct effects of climate-induced natural disasters upon other populations. And loss and damage is typically referred to as the compensation expected by the affected nations, the lower income developing nations, from the more developed nations in that generated the greenhouse gases that has been the cause of this abrupt climate change. So it's important to discuss the definition of loss and damage in more detail. But the reason I bring it up at the beginning of the COP discussions or conference is it said that it delayed some of the controversy surrounding this and the initial discussions among the delegations to COP. This was a sticking point, and the controversy somewhat marred or delayed the progress of COP this year. So Dr. Adele Thomas is the lead author of the IPCC 2022 report on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. And he describes loss and damage as the negative impacts of climate change that occur despite or in the absence of mitigation or adaptation. So where does loss and damage fit into the overall climate crisis set of challenges? And I'll offer that from my personal perspective. I see the priorities falling into basically 4 categories. First among those are mitigation, basically halting greenhouse gas emissions from our current sources, energy generation, agriculture, industrial production, and so on. And then second, extracting and eliminating the greenhouse gases already in the atmosphere, as well as the carbon dioxide in the oceans. So both of those sort of fall into the category of mitigation. Second is energy expansion. It seems that we're going to need to generate vastly more energy from net zero emission sources. That's going to be necessary to address the other climate priorities and to provide a foundation for improved standard of living for people in all nations. And when I say energy necessary to address the other categories of the climate crisis, I'm referring to resiliency and fortification, for one. And this is the process of protecting our communities from the disasters that are going to result from climate change. And then lastly, fourth is loss and damage compensation. So we've got these 4 categories: mitigation, energy expansion, resiliency and fortification, and then loss and damage. Now, without mitigation, all we're really doing is delaying our civilization's ultimate demise. Therefore, the priority for our investment must always be on mitigation and energy expansion. By investing in these areas, we benefit everyone, the rich and the poor nations alike. Everyone has an interest in some people surviving this climate catastrophe. Now, resiliency, loss, and damage are necessary. Why? Well, one, it's sort of a moral requirement. It has to do with reducing human suffering. It's a moral obligation on the part of everyone on the planet to help everyone else on the planet. And then secondly, a more sort of dispassionate motivation for loss and damage compensation is we're going to need to maintain social order so that the infrastructure for progress and industrial and technical solutions remain viable and are not destroyed by social disorder and global conflict. So the majority of the investment must go to mitigation and energy expansion. And perhaps a set percentage of that overall investment must be allocated to loss and damage. But to visualize the challenges of getting the more wealthy nations and the fossil fuel producing nations to compensate the financially challenged nations, that's going to be quite an undertaking. For example, in the USA, just a few years ago, the federal government refused to compensate some of its own states simply because the differences in political leadership at the state level. So we have states in our nation, in the United States, that suffered loss and damage, in effect, from the climate implications, and our own federal government refused to compensate them. So how do you think that a government, such a government, would deal with foreign nations if that's the way it deals with its own nation? So I'm not sure that the moralistic approach is going to be the successful one. I think it has to be a more hard-edged bargain where the richer nations have to understand that it's in their direct interest to offer this compensation, simply to maintain social order and stability. Now, what is the basis for who might pay in a loss and damage situation? Should it be the wealthy nations paying the poor nations, or might fossil fuel production be a better basis? For example, you've got a nation like Nigeria that generates vast amounts of fossil fuels and sells them to other nations, but they're produced and economic benefit accrued to the nation, the production nation, as well as the developing nation. So the accounting system might get quite complicated in determining responsibility for loss and damage, as opposed to simply an ability to pay. Second, what's the basis of the human suffering? Human suffering comes from two sources. One is the hardships following from these natural disasters. And second is the number of people actually in that place to suffer those consequences. So obviously, the most effective way to eliminate human suffering is to stop creating new humans. Fewer people, in effect, less suffering. This is also the most effective way of reducing a person's own carbon footprint. Personally, because of climate change, which was obvious back in the 80s and the 90s, I've made a personal choice not to have children until a later date and a very few children. So at the age of 62, I have simply one child at age 17 months. And my parents, similarly born in the 1940s, early 40s, decided to have only two children themselves. So to what extent is the cumulative human suffering of people in poor nations the result of population differences, and how much of it is due to the drivers of fossil fuel upon climate change? But it's a very complex accounting question, assuming you want to treat it as a dispassionate calculation. Personally, since it involves people who are alive today, I can't treat it as a cold cause and effect computation. That's what lawyers do, and trust me, they will do that. The only nation that has deliberately limited its reproduction rate is China through its previous one child policy. And this policy caused a lot of criticism throughout the world, particularly in the USA, of the Communist Party's conduct relative to its people on this matter. So often right and wrong and good and bad are characterizations that can really change over time, depending upon the time scale at which you observe the outcomes. What might look like a bad or unpopular decision today may prove to be wise and beneficial decades into the future. And what about the decisions that these poor nations are making today? You know, are they making the choices that are fundamentally different from that of the richer nations? This speaks to the moral aspects of the responsibility. So again, all of these questions can be sidelined if we simply look at it on a more direct, beneficial level as far as enhancing stability for the more developed nations that are going to have to take on the challenge of developing the technological solutions to this climate crisis. So it's a complicated issue, and it's one that's going to be discussed much more extensively here at this COP gathering. And what I'm hoping that we'll be able to do, Val Holly, Esteban, and myself, is monitor some of these discussions and capture some of the arguments that are being made on all sides, and encapsulate them and present them back to the group here through these briefings. Brock?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, John, for that presentation. I think it does set a very crucial tone, I think, in terms of how these negotiations ought to be discussed, or at least some of the end results of these negotiations. We do have one question, and then I'll turn it over for final discussions here amongst our group. But Rhonda has asked, has there ever been a high-level discussion at COP about population? I can personally say from my own attendance at each of these COP events, you won't see it at the main deliberations and main discussions. The things and the discussions that appear on TV, population is not typically amongst those topics discussed there. Population is more discussed at the one-on-ones, the smaller discussions between scientists, between politicians, between people who are having a one-on-one discussion, never at an actual event. It's kind of a massive elephant in the room that is a very taboo topic, especially given the fact that many of these folks attending these COP delegations, they're politicians. They're going to go home and expect to have to report and to have to defend themselves in any kind of election. And notice that in the day and age of cell phones and iPhones and cameras, we can whip it out and get a quick quote from somebody on video. You have to be super careful about what you say, or else you're going to lose your next election. Anyway, anyone else have thoughts about the discussions about population at COP?
Well, population is obviously a factor, because environmental impacts, negative environmental impacts, are a function of a couple of factors. You basically take your population and you multiply it by your per capita consumption. That is a gross consumption figure and leads to direct negative implications for the environment. And then if you take that quantity, the population times per capita consumption, and you divide it by, say, a technological sustainability index, then that reduces, in effect, the negative impacts upon the environment. So you can offset population by either curbing your consumption or by increasing your sustainable technology. And obviously we need to do both. But whereas amongst us, we are probably heavily focused on our consumption being disproportionately weighted to investment. In other words, we're working towards solutions of these issues, investing our time and our money in developing new technologies and solutions that are sustainable. Whereas other people, which is quite obvious in this resort town, spend a significant portion of their disposable income on recreation and leisure and excessive consumption. So it's difficult to get people to make what we might consider wiser choices, and often it falls upon collective action and government regulation to sort of steer consumption toward investment and minimize consumption. So population times consumption divided by sustainable technology.
Technology and consumption, or the technology function and the consumption function, are also vital tools here. But I think if we were to also manage the population one, tackle all three at the same time is the best scenario possible. Hopefully discussions of all three will be prevalent here at the COP, although I don't have the best feelings about the population one. Anyway, any lasting closing thoughts regarding Campus Climate Corps' Day 3 program?
Just to add to your comments about how petrostates are having a very important role and a very visible role at COP, and considering the next destination of COP, I just wanted to share with the audience a picture just to illustrate a little bit of the size of the investment into pavilions that petrostates can make. And before in Michael's video, we saw essentially the size of the Saudi Arabia pavilion, but Rock, may I share screen?
Go ahead and yes, go for it.
All right, real quick. All right, can you all see this picture?
Yeah, looks good.
Okay, well, this is actually the United Arab Emirates pavilion, just for you to see the size of this pavilion. There are many people inside at different distances. It is huge. Most of the pavilions are not nearly as big as this one. Even the ones of very rich nations, very rich European nations, don't have this size. And at the same time, this is the other point that I wanted to show. This is the size of the Egyptian pavilion, also very considerable. It's natural given that they are the hosts, but again, consider that petrostates are having pavilions as big as the one of the host.
That is some really fantastic imagery. Also a little bit depressing, but fantastic imagery. I'm sure we'll continue our discussion on that tomorrow. All right, any other closing thoughts before we close off our day 3 program? All right, well, thank you so much from our team in Egypt and here in Florida. Thank you so much for tuning in to today's Campus Climate Corps Day 3 program. We'll plan on seeing each of you tomorrow for Campus Climate Corps' Day 4 program. As always, feel free to email, get in touch with one of us if there's something specific you want to see at COP27 this year. If there's any kind of discussions you'd like to see happening, even amongst ourselves, please do let us know. And until then, we hope you have a wonderful night